My son told his rich friends I was just the gardener. He said, "Don't mind the old help." I put down my shovel and called my lawyer. I cut his $50,000 monthly allowance to zero. That happened on a Saturday afternoon in September in the backyard of my home in Scottsdale, Arizona. I was in the garden when they arrived. My son, Nathan, had driven up from his house in Paradise Valley with four of his friends, all in their early 30s, all in the specific uniform of men who had never worked with their hands and who communicated this through the quality of their shoes and the way they carried themselves in spaces they had never contributed anything to. I had been in the garden since 7 that morning. I liked the garden. I had built it over 6 years. The desert landscaping, the raised vegetable beds, the mature citrus trees along the back wall. I knew every plant in it by name and by what it needed and by how it responded to the specific Arizona seasons. Nathan came around the corner of the house with his friends. He saw me. He glanced at me. He said to his friends, without stopping walking, without looking at me again, "Don't mind the old help. We pay someone to keep this place up." He kept walking toward the back patio. His friends laughed. One of them looked at me and nodded in the specific way that people nodded at service staff when they were acknowledging you existed without acknowledging you as a person. I stood in the garden with my shovel. I watched them go to the patio. Nathan pulled the outdoor refrigerator open and handed his friends drinks. He sat in one of the chairs I had bought for the patio renovation we had done in 2020, and he leaned back, and he started talking about something that made his friends laugh again. He had not looked at me a second time. I set the shovel against the raised bed. I walked through the side gate to the front of the house. I sat in my truck. I called my attorney, a man named Scott Hensley who had been handling my business and personal legal matters for 18 years, and who picked up his phone on the second ring because that is what Scott did. I said, "Scott, I need to make a change to Nathan's trust distribution." He said, "What kind of change?" I said, "Effective immediately, I want to suspend the monthly distribution completely." He said, "All of it?" I said, "All 50,000 today." He said, "I can have the paperwork processed by Monday morning." I said, "Process it today." He said, "It is Saturday." I said, "I know what day it is, Scott." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I will have it done by 5 this afternoon." I said, "Thank you." I sat in the truck. I thought about a boy I had known when he was small enough to ride on my shoulders through the Tucson farmers markets on Saturday mornings, while his mother looked at vegetables, and he held onto my head with both hands because that was what he needed to do to feel secure. I thought about the man on the patio who had just told 4 strangers that his father was the hired help. I drove to the Home Depot on Scottsdale Road, and I bought 3 more bags of soil amendment. I went back to the garden. I finished what I had been doing when they arrived. They left 3 hours later. Nathan did not come to find me before he left. Subscribe right now, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Every week a new story. Let us go back to where this really started. My name is Gerald Ashworth, and I am 64 years old. I was born in Tucson, Arizona in 1960, the second child of Harold and Beverly Ashworth. My father worked at a copper mine 40 miles outside the city, not in management, on the floor. 12-hour shifts, rotating schedule, the specific physical grind of industrial mining in the Arizona desert that produced in my father a specific quality of tiredness that was present every evening, and that he carried with the particular quiet dignity of a man who understood his work was necessary, and who did it without complaint. He was a large man with permanently roughened hands and the specific posture of someone whose body had been doing hard physical work for decades. He was not an emotional man in the demonstrative sense. He showed his feelings through what he did rather than what he said. When he came home from a long shift and sat at the dinner table and asked about my day, that was his way of saying I love you and I am here. He was never not there. My mother, Beverly, managed the household with the specific efficiency of someone for whom organization was a genuine coping mechanism. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company in Tucson for 14 years while also running the house and raising 2 children. She balanced 2 sets of books, the company's and ours, with equal precision. She was the one who noticed that I had a specific relationship with numbers. When I was 10, she found me at the kitchen table going through her grocery receipts, comparing them to her written shopping list, and cross-referencing against what the list had cost the previous month. She stood in the doorway and watched me do this. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "You spent $6 more on produce this month than last month, but the pantry staples cost $3 less, so the total is actually down." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Why does that interest you?" I said, "Because the numbers tell you what actually happened, not what you thought happened." She was quiet. She said, "Your grandmother's older brother worked in accounting." I said, "What is accounting?" She sat down and she explained it to me. That conversation shaped the next 50 years. I went to the University of Arizona in 1978 on an academic scholarship that covered tuition with enough left over for books if I was careful. I was careful. I studied accounting and finance, which were the fields that matched the specific way my brain had been working since I was sitting at my mother's kitchen table going through grocery receipts. I graduated in 1982. I went to work at a mid-size accounting firm in Phoenix. The firm was called Harmon and Brill. 8 partners, 40 staff, clients across the Phoenix metro area spanning small businesses, real estate developers, and the specific category of individuals who had accumulated enough wealth to need professional management of the complexity that wealth produced. I was good at my job in the way that people were good at things when the thing matched what their brain was naturally doing anyway. I could look at a financial statement and see not just what it said, but what it meant about the situation it described. I could identify where the risk was, where the opportunity was, where the story the numbers were telling diverged from the story the client believed. By 1988, I was a senior associate. By 1990, I was being discussed for a partnership track that the firm's senior partners described as accelerated. And that was when I made the decision that changed everything. I left Harmon and Brill. Not for another firm, for myself. I registered Ashworth Financial Group in September of 1990. It was a terrible time economically. The real estate market had collapsed. The savings and loan crisis was producing financial wreckage across the Southwest. Most people with professional options were moving toward security, not away from it. I moved away from it because I had been watching something for 8 years from inside a firm, and I understood clearly what the gap was and how to fill it. The gap was this. Mid-size real estate investors in the Phoenix metropolitan area were making investment decisions with inadequate financial modeling. The large institutional investors had sophisticated analysis. The small investors made decisions based on gut and basic spreadsheets. The mid-size investors, the ones with 2 to 30 million in investment capital, were making decisions that were more sophisticated than gut but less sophisticated than what their risk level actually required. I built a practice specifically for that segment. Not investment management, financial analysis and advisory. I helped mid-size real estate investors understand what they were actually buying, what the realistic performance scenarios were, what the risk factors looked like modeled honestly rather than optimistically. The first year was the hardest year of my professional life. I had 4 clients in 1990. All of them came from the network I had built at Harmon and Brill. One of them paid late 3 times. One of them decided after 6 months to move their work back to a larger firm. By December of 1990, I had 2 clients and a cash flow situation that required me to have a direct conversation with myself about whether I had made a serious mistake. I decided I had not made a mistake. I decided I had made the right move at the wrong time, and that the right response to a wrong time was to work harder and be more patient, and not change the strategy because the timing was difficult. I kept going. My second client in 1990, one was a commercial real estate developer named Vic Hernandez, who had been referred to me by a mutual contact, and who came to me with a specific problem. He had 3 projects in various stages of development, and he could not get a clear picture of his total exposure across all 3 simultaneously. I built him the clearest integrated financial picture he had ever had of his development portfolio. He called me 3 weeks after I delivered it and said, "Gerald, this is the most useful thing any financial advisor has ever given me." I said, "I am glad it was useful." He said, "I want you to meet 2 people." The 2 people he introduced me to became 2 of my most significant long-term clients. Both of those referrals produced referrals of their own. The practice grew the way sustainable practices grew, slowly, through genuine value delivered consistently, through the specific trust economy of a professional services field, where word of mouth was the primary channel, and word of mouth was driven entirely by results. By 1995, Ashworth Financial Group had 12 clients and revenue that was sustaining the firm, and its 3 staff members comfortably. By 2000, we had 29 clients and revenue of just over $2 million. By 2005, we had 41 clients, and I had made the decision to expand from pure advisory work into actual investment alongside clients, co-investing with my own capital in the same projects I was analyzing for them. That decision produced the compound growth that changed the firm's scale. By 2010, the co-investment portfolio was performing in ways that the pure advisory work had never produced. By 2015, I had sold the advisory practice to a larger regional wealth management firm for a significant number, and retained the investment portfolio, which had, by that point, become the primary driver of everything. I want to be direct about what I had built by the time Nathan said, "Don't mind the old help" on a September Saturday in my backyard. The investment portfolio included commercial real estate positions across Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado, a private equity stake in a regional logistics company, a minority interest in 3 technology companies that had been early stage when I invested and that were now mature, and the house in Scottsdale, which I had purchased in 2009, and which I had been improving and maintaining with my own hands for 15 years, because the garden was genuinely something I loved, and because keeping my hands in soil was the thing that reminded me of what actual work felt like. The net asset value of the portfolio, as of the most recent quarterly review, was approximately $64 million. Nathan received $50,000 per month from a trust distribution that I had set up in 2019, when he had come to me with a business plan that required capital to execute. The business plan had not executed. The $50,000 per month had continued anyway. It had continued because he was my son, and because I loved him, and because I had told myself that the money was helping him build something even when the evidence for that was increasingly difficult to find. It stopped on a Saturday afternoon when he told his friends I was the help. Subscribe right now and stay right here, because the next section is where I tell you about Nathan's mother and about how he became who he was on that Saturday. Nathan's mother was a woman named Patricia Collins. I met Patricia in 1991 at a Chamber of Commerce event in Scottsdale. She was 28, working in commercial real estate marketing, with the specific social ease of someone who had been in professional networking environments since her first job, and who moved through rooms with the practiced grace of someone who understood that being remembered was as important as being capable. She was beautiful in an assembled way. She understood presentation in the way that people understood it when it had been important for a long time. We dated for 18 months. We married in 1993. I want to be honest about what the marriage was because the honest version is the only version that explains Nathan. The early years were good in the surface way. Patricia was engaging, socially skilled, genuinely enjoyable company in the specific circumstances where her qualities worked best. She liked nice things, and she had the aesthetic intelligence to acquire them well. The house in Scottsdale had her fingerprints on it in ways that were genuinely beautiful. What the marriage lacked was the depth that required both people to be present in their full version. Patricia was never fully present. She was always performing. The performance was good, but it was the whole thing, and underneath it was an emptiness that I started to feel clearly by year 3. Nathan was born in 1993. He arrived in the specific way that children arrived when the timing was both right and complicated. Right because he was genuinely wanted. Complicated because the marriage he arrived into was already showing the structural cracks that would eventually be undeniable. Patricia loved Nathan in the specific way she loved things that were extensions of her presentation. He was a beautiful child who reflected well on her, and she gave him the specific kind of attention that she gave to things that reflected well on her, considerable, lavish, and entirely about what he represented rather than who he was. She also gave him everything he wanted, not as genuine generosity, as the specific parenting approach of someone for whom a child's unhappiness was a reflection on the parent rather than a condition to be sat with and worked through. Nathan cried, Patricia fixed it. Nathan wanted, Patricia provided. Nathan expressed disappointment. Patricia redirected reality rather than allowing him to sit with the disappointment. I saw this happening, and I addressed it 3 times in ways that produced the specific marital argument that the issue always produced. Patricia said, "You are too hard on him. He is a child. Children should be happy." I said, "Children should learn that happiness comes from what you do and who you are, not from what you receive." She said, "You are projecting your childhood onto him." I said, "I am trying to give him what my parents gave me." She said, "Your parents gave you a childhood without enough. That is not what I want for Nathan." That sentence, a childhood without enough, communicated everything about the gap between us. My parents had given me the specific gift of having to earn things and of understanding that the earning was the education. Patricia heard that childhood as deprivation. I heard it as preparation. We separated in 2001 when Nathan was 8. The divorce was finalized in 2002. Patricia received a settlement that was fair, and that she negotiated aggressively through an attorney who was very good at aggressive negotiation. Nathan lived primarily with Patricia. I had him every other weekend and for significant portions of school breaks, and I showed up for everything that required showing up, school events, sports, the specific things that marked the years of a growing boy's life. What I could not do was undo 8 years of Patricia's specific parenting approach and the particular version of Nathan it was producing. I watched it develop. Nathan at 12 was the specific kind of boy who was charming when he wanted something and dismissive when he did not. He had the social ease of his mother and the intelligence that came from somewhere in both of us, but he was applying both primarily to managing his environment rather than to building anything. Nathan at 16 was the specific kind of teenager who understood status and who organized his social world entirely around it. His friend group was the friend group of kids from wealthy Scottsdale families who had been told their whole lives that what they had was what they were. Nathan, at 22, graduated from Arizona State with a business degree and came to me with the specific confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional and who had never been required to demonstrate the exceptionality in any arena where the telling was not sufficient. He wanted to start a business. He wanted me to fund it. I asked him to present the plan. He presented it. The plan was for a lifestyle and travel media company that would produce premium content for high-net-worth travelers. The concept was real enough. There was a market for this. The execution plan was the problem. Nathan had outlined a team structure that required 12 people from day one, a marketing budget that assumed an audience he had not yet built, and revenue projections that were based on comparison to established players in the space, rather than on any realistic model of how a startup reached that scale. I said, the concept is interesting. The plan needs work. Specifically, the headcount model is not appropriate for a startup, and the revenue projections are built on comparisons rather than assumptions. He said, I have done my research. I said, your research shows you what established companies look like. It does not show you what the path from zero to there looks like. Those are different things. He said, I thought you were going to support this. I said, I am going to support you developing a plan that can actually work. The current plan cannot actually work. He left frustrated. He came back 6 weeks later with a revised plan. The revised plan was better, still not right. We went through 3 more iterations over 4 months. By the time the plan was at a stage where I would invest in it for someone else, I wrote him a check. $250,000 to get started. The business launched in early 2019. It struggled in the specific ways that media businesses struggled when the operator had not built a distribution channel before building the content. By late 2019, it was clear the business was not going to make it in its current form. Nathan came to me. He said, I need more runway. I said, the business model needs to change before more runway is useful. He said, I just need more time. I said, Nathan, more time executing the current model produces more losses. What needs to change is the model. He said, I know the business better than you do. I said, I know business better than you do. That is a different statement. He said, are you going to help me or not? I said, I will set up a monthly distribution that covers your living expenses while you rebuild the model. $50,000 a month. That is the support. The additional capital injection is conditional on a revised plan that addresses the distribution problem. He said, okay. He took the $50,000. The revised plan never arrived. The $50,000 continued anyway because he was my son, and because I kept believing the plan was coming, and because I did not want to have the hard conversation that the situation increasingly required. Until September. Until the garden. Until don't mind the old help. Subscribe right now. The next section is Nathan's call. Nathan called at 7:45 that evening. I was in the kitchen making dinner. The garden work had taken until 5 and I had come in and showered, and I was making the specific simple meal I made when I did not want to think about food while I thought about other things. His number appeared on the phone. I let it ring twice. I answered. He said, Dad. I said, Nathan. He said, I heard from the trust administrator. I said, yes. He said, the distribution was suspended. I said, effective today, yes. He said, all of it. I said, all of it. He said, Dad, I need that income. My whole financial situation is structured around that distribution. I said, I know. He said, you cannot just cut it off without warning. I said, I can. The trust documentation gives me full discretion over the distribution amount and timing. You can verify that with your own attorney. He said, this is about today. About the backyard. I said, yes. He said, Dad, it was a joke. They are my friends. I was being funny. I said, Nathan, you told 4 people you did not know that the man working in the garden was the hired help. That man was your father. You said it without looking at me and you kept walking. He said, I know what I said. I said, then you understand why I am treating it the way I am treating it. He said, cutting off $50,000 a month is not a proportionate response to a bad joke. I said, that is one way to look at it. He said, what is the other way? I said, the other way is that the $50,000 a month has been producing a version of you who tells people his father is the hired help. He was quiet. He said, that is not what that money has been producing. I said, Nathan, I have been watching what that money has been producing for 5 years. It has been producing a man who has his father's financial support and who has been telling his friends his father is the help. He said, you were in the garden with a shovel. What were they supposed to think? I said, they were supposed to think whatever they thought. You were supposed to say this is my father. He said nothing. I said, when I was your age, I was working 14-hour days building a practice from nothing. My father worked in a copper mine. I went to a state school on a scholarship. The money I built came from work that looked exactly like what you saw in that garden today, hands in the dirt, physical effort, the unglamorous version of what building something actually required. And you looked at that, and you told strangers it was the hired help. His voice was tight. He said, I know where the money came from. I said, I wonder about that sometimes. He said, that is not fair. I said, Nathan, I gave you $250,000 to start a business that did not succeed. I have been giving you $50,000 a month for 5 years. What have you built with it? Silence. He said, I have been working on things. I said, tell me one thing you have built. More silence. I said, I am not asking the question to humiliate you. I am asking because I want to know the answer. He said, the media company. I said, is not operating. I know because the financial reports still come to me as the original investor. He said, I have been pivoting. I said, to what? He said, to Content Strategy Consulting. I said, how many clients do you have? He said, I am building the pipeline. I said, how many clients? He said, 2 conversations in progress. I said conversations, not clients. He said nothing. I said, Nathan, you are 31 years old. You are intelligent. You have resources and education and a network that most people your age would trade significant things for. And you have been living on $50,000 a month for 5 years without building anything that can sustain itself independently. He said, you are talking to me like I am a failure. I said, I am talking to you like you are someone who has been given everything they needed to succeed and who has not yet made the specific decision to actually do the work. He said, some things take time. I said, yes, some things take time and work. The work part has been missing. He said, so what? You just cut off the money and that is supposed to fix everything. I said, I cut off the money because what I did in that garden today was work. I was not performing being a rich man who had someone come take care of his garden. I was in my garden because I love my garden and because getting my hands in the dirt is something I have done my whole life because it connects me to what actual effort feels like. And my son looked at that and he told his friends it was the help. He was quiet for a long time. He said, I should not have said it. I said, no, you should not have. He said, I embarrassed you. I said, you embarrassed yourself. In front of people whose opinion of you is apparently more important to you than reality. He said, Dad. I said, Nathan, I love you. I have loved you since before you were born. That has never been and will never be in question. He said, but. I said, but loving you means I have to stop doing things that are hurting you. The 50,000 a month has been hurting you. You have been living inside a financial situation that your own work has not produced, and it is producing a version of you that told 4 strangers his father was the hired help without flinching. He said one comment. I said one comment that revealed a pattern I have been watching for 5 years. He was very quiet. He said, "What do I do now?" I said, "That is the first good question you have asked in this conversation." I said, "You build something, something real, something that requires work that is unglamorous and that does not produce results immediately, and that requires you to be wrong and correct and wrong again. The work that looks like a man in his garden with a shovel." He said, "That sounds like you telling me to be you." I said, "I am telling you to be something, anything, as long as it is genuinely yours." He said, "And the distribution?" I said, "The distribution will be reconsidered when you have something to show me, something real, something built." He said, "How will you know if it's real?" I said, "Nathan, I have been doing financial analysis for 35 years. I will know." He was quiet. He said, "Okay." He said it quietly, without performance, just okay. I said, "Good night, Nathan." He said, "Good night, Dad." I finished making dinner. I ate alone at the kitchen table. I looked out at the backyard. The garden was dark, but I knew every part of it. Subscribe right now and stay with me. The next section is what happened in the 6 months after that phone call. November came and Nathan called. He called on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. He had historically called on weekends when he was between social things and had a pocket of time that he was filling with obligation calls. Wednesday meant something different. He said, "Dad, can I come see you?" I said, "Yes, when?" He said, "This Saturday." I said, "Come for lunch." He arrived at 11:30. He was in different clothes than I was used to seeing on him at the house, not the specific assembled casual of someone performing a wealthy Saturday, but actual practical clothes. Dark pants, a simple shirt, work boots that had been used. He came around to the backyard, without being told to. I was in the garden, Saturday morning, same place I was when the whole thing had happened 2 months earlier. He stood at the edge of the raised bed. He said, "Can I help?" I looked at him. I said, "You can turn the compost bin." He said, "Show me how." I showed him. He turned the compost. We worked for an hour without talking about anything except the garden, what needed doing, how to do it. I showed him the difference between the soil in the beds I had amended properly and the soil in the section I had not gotten to yet. He paid attention. We went inside at 12:30, and I made sandwiches, and we sat at the kitchen table. He said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Okay." He said, "The month after you cut the distribution, I went through the most uncomfortable month I have had as an adult. Genuinely uncomfortable. I had to look at my actual expenses versus my actual income, which was effectively zero, and figure out what that meant." I said, "What did it mean?" He said, "It meant I had been lying to myself for 5 years. About the business, about what I was building, about what the money was covering." I said, "What was it covering?" He said, "A lifestyle I had not earned. A version of myself that was funded by you and that I was performing for the people around me like I had built it." I said, "Yes." He said, "I owe you an apology for the garden thing. A real one, not the one I tried to give you on the phone." I said, "Okay." He said, "I looked at you with a shovel in your hand, and I saw something I had been ashamed of. The version of success that was physical and unglamorous and that my friends would not understand as success. And instead of being honest about that shame, I redirected it by calling you the help." I looked at him. He said, I was ashamed of something that should have been the opposite of shameful. My father built $60-something million from scratch starting with nothing, and when he was in his garden on a Saturday, I looked at him and felt embarrassed. He said, "That is a problem with me, not with you." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to fix it." I said, "How?" He said, "I want to show you something." He pulled out his phone and he showed me a document, a business plan, 8 pages, tight, specific, with assumptions that were labeled as assumptions, and with a realistic model for year one that started small and built. Content strategy consulting. The same direction he had mentioned on the phone 2 months earlier, but now built out into something that had mechanics behind it. I read it at the kitchen table. He watched me read it. I read it twice. I set the phone down. I said, "The client acquisition model is realistic for year one." He said, "Yes. 2 to 3 clients is achievable through my existing network if I am honest about what I am offering." I said, "The pricing model is slightly low for the market." He said, "I kept it conservative because I wanted to be honest about what I could deliver at this stage." I said, "That is the right instinct." He said, "The projections are month by month. I built them that way because I wanted to see how long it would take to get to something self-sustaining." I said, "When does it get self-sustaining on this model?" He said, "Month 18 if the client count tracks to plan, month 24 if it is slower." I said, "That is an honest timeline." He said, "Yes." I said, "How many clients have you approached since October?" He said, 4 conversations, 2 are serious." I said, "Not just conversations." He said, "No, 2 of them are at proposal stage." I said, "When do you know?" He said, "One of them by the end of November." I looked at him. He was doing the thing I had been waiting to see for 5 years. He was present in his own situation. He was not managing an impression. He was telling me what was actually happening. I said, "What do you need from me?" He said, 2 things. I said, "Tell me." He said, "The first thing is your opinion on the plan, honest opinion, where it is wrong." I said, "I will give you that today." He said, "The second thing is harder to ask." I said, "Ask it." He said, "I need you to stay in my life while I do this. As my father, not as the distributor of the monthly check. As the man who was in the garden when I said something inexcusable." I said, "Nathan." He said, "I know that sounds backwards. I know I should be the one earning the relationship back, not asking you to commit to it. But I am trying to be honest about what I actually need, and what I actually need is for you to not disappear while I work on becoming someone worth being in a relationship with." The kitchen was quiet. I said, "I was never going to disappear." He said, "I know that intellectually. I needed to hear it." I said, "I was never going to disappear. You are my son. That does not negotiate." He exhaled slowly. I said, "Now, the plan, page 3. We spent 4 hours on the plan. Every page, every assumption, every number." He took notes. He pushed back twice on things I said. Both times he was at least partially right. That told me something. He left at 5:30. He shook my hand at the door. Not a performative handshake. The handshake of someone who was treating an interaction as real and who wanted it to feel real. He drove back to Phoenix. I went back to the kitchen. I called Scott Hensley. I said, "Scott, I want to set up a conditional distribution arrangement for Nathan's trust, conditional on documented business revenue." He said, "What threshold?" I said, "No distribution until Nathan demonstrates $10,000 in earned revenue in a calendar month from a legitimate business operation." He said, "Earned revenue meaning client payments?" I said, "Yes, not gifts, not loans, not transfers from accounts I control, earned." He said, "And once he hits the threshold?" I said, We revisit the distribution amount based on what he is actually building. Monthly conversation between me and Nathan about the business before any distribution decision. Scott said, "That is a substantial change from the previous structure." I said, "The previous structure was not producing anything useful." He said, "I will have the documentation ready by Wednesday." I said, "Thank you." I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the backyard. Dark outside. The desert silence that came after sunset in Scottsdale when the heat had finally relented, and the air was the specific dry coolness of an Arizona fall evening. I thought about my father in the copper mine, 40 miles outside Tucson. I thought about what he had given me by being exactly what he was and expecting exactly what he expected. Stay with me for the final section, because the ending is not what you expect. Nathan closed his first client in late November. He called me the morning it happened. He said the proposal came back signed. I said, "What is the contract value?" He told me. Monthly retainer, 6-month initial term, a marketing agency in Phoenix that needed strategic content guidance and that had found Nathan through a mutual contact in his existing network. I said, "That is a real contract." He said, "Yes." He said it with the specific quality of someone who was surprised by how a real contract felt different from a theoretical one. I said, "How does it feel?" He said, "Different from what I expected." I said, "Different how?" He said, "Heavier, like it is real weight instead of just a number." I said, "Yes, that is what earning feels like." He said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I have been in the office at 6 every morning for the last 3 weeks, not because anyone told me to, because the work required it." I said, "What changed?" He said, "The money stopped." He said it simply. He said, "I know that sounds bad, like I only work when I have to, but I think what happened is more specific than that." I said, "Explain it to me." He said, "When the distribution was there, every day had a cushion. If the work did not happen that day, the money was still coming. The cushion made the work optional in a way I was not consciously aware of." I said, "And without the cushion?" He said, "The work is the only thing, and when the work is the only thing, you get up at 6 because you actually have to, and it turns out that getting up at 6 because you actually have to is completely different from getting up at 10, because you technically could get up at 6. I said, "Yes." He said, "Dad, I owe you a different kind of thank you than I thought I was going to owe you when you cut the distribution." I said, "What kind?" He said, "The real kind." I said, "You do not need to thank me for anything yet. The first client is the beginning of something. It is a long way from the end." He said, "I know." He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Ask." He said, "The garden. You are in it every Saturday. You have been doing it for years." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I said, "I told you, I love the garden." He said, "But you could hire someone." I said I could. He said, "So why?" I said, "Because the garden is mine. Every plant in it is where it is because I put it there. The soil is the way it is because I amended it. The citrus trees took 6 years to mature. I know all of that because I was there for all of it." He said, "It is not about the garden." I said, "No, it is not." He said, "It is about owning something you built." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. He said, "I want to have that." I said, "You are starting to." He said, "The content strategy company is not a garden." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It is the thing I am building, for better or worse. The thing that is mine because I am doing the work." I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." December came. He had 2 clients by December. January he had 3. In February, he called to tell me he had hired his first contractor, a part-time writer who handled content production, while Nathan focused on strategy and client relationships. He called to tell me because he wanted to tell someone who would understand what hearing the first person meant, what it meant to be responsible for someone else's work arrangement, what it meant for the business to be big enough that he could not do all of it himself. I understood. I told him I understood. In March, Nathan came to the house on a Saturday. He came at 7 in the morning. He brought his own gloves. He came around to the backyard, and he stood at the raised beds and he said, "Show me what needs doing." I showed him. We worked until noon. His gloves were dirty. His shoes were dirty. He was present in the garden in the specific way of someone who was doing real work and who was finding out what real work felt like. At noon, I made sandwiches. We sat at the kitchen table. He said, "I understand the garden now." I said, "Tell me." He said, "It is the clearest version of what you teach about everything. You put the work in. The soil responds. The plants come. You cannot rush any of it and you cannot fake any of it. The plants do not care about the story you tell about them. They care about the work you actually did." I looked at my son. I said, "Yes." He said, "I am trying to garden my business." I said, "I know." He said, "It is slower than I thought it would be." I said, "Most things worth building are." He said, "You knew that when you were 31. I said, "I did not know it. I was learning it the same way you are learning it, from the inside." He said, "You had a copper miner father telling you to work." I said, "And you have a gardener father telling you the same thing." He smiled. The real version of Nathan's smile. The one that came from something actual rather than from social management. I said, "There is something I want to tell you." He said, "Tell me." I said, "The distribution. I am reinstating $3,000 a month while the business is finding its footing." He said, "Dad." I said, 3,000. That is not the lifestyle fund. That is the buffer between a slow month and a missed rent payment. The work is what pays for everything else." He said, "I was not expecting that." I said, "I know." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you have been in the garden." He looked at me. He said, "The real one or?" I said, "Both." He nodded. He finished his sandwich. He put his plate in the sink. He picked up his dirty gloves from the counter. He said, "I am going to come back next Saturday." I said, "I will be here." He went to his car. I watched him drive away from the kitchen window. Then I went back to the garden. I want to tell you what the "don't mind the old help" moment actually was. It was not the moment my son revealed who he was. It was the moment the distance between who he was and who he was built to be became undeniable. Nathan was not a bad person. He had been shaped by a specific combination of things: a mother who gave him everything, a father who built something quietly, a financial arrangement that had insulated him from the specific education that comes from needing to earn. The "don't mind the old help" comment came from a boy who had never been taught that a man with a shovel in a garden was building something worth respecting, who had been surrounded by people whose measure of a person was the visible external signal rather than the invisible internal substance. He had been surrounded by those people because $50,000 a month had placed him in that world. Removing the 50,000 did not immediately fix anything. What it did was remove the insulation. It made Nathan feel the temperature of his actual situation for the first time in 5 years. And when he felt it, he got up at 6 in the morning. He went to his office. He built something. The building was slow and specific and unglamorous, and it was exactly what it needed to be. My father stood in a copper mine for 30 years. His hands were the proof of his life. He gave me the specific inheritance that mattered, the understanding that the work was the thing, that the unglamorous version of what you were building was the honest version, that a man with a shovel in his own garden was not the hired help. He was the owner. I carried that. And in the end, after some difficult months, Nathan started carrying it too. He comes to the garden on Saturdays now. His gloves get dirty. He is learning what that feels like. Drop a comment and tell me something real. Tell me about the moment in your life when someone underestimated what the unglamorous work represented. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what you are building. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. Every week a new story, and every story earns the time you spend with it. Thank you for being here.